Before the rifle ever came into view, the danger already existed. That's the part most people miss. When we imagine the Old West, we picture rifles slung openly across saddles, long barrels catching the sun, a clear signal of power and intent. It looks bold, honest, almost ceremonial. But that image belongs to paintings and films, not to the daily reality of frontier life. In the real West, carrying a large rifle in public was a problem. Not because rifles were rare and they were everywhere, but because visibility created consequences. A visible rifle changed how people reacted to you. It drew attention. It raised suspicion. In towns, it could get you fined, disarmed, or followed. On the trail, it could mark you as a threat worth testing or a prize worth stealing. Cowboys learned early that survival wasn't about showing what you had. It was about controlling what others believed you had. Large rifles posed a unique challenge. Unlike pistols, they couldn't be tucked into a pocket or hidden under a coat. A Winchester or Sharps was long, unmistakable, and difficult to conceal completely. Yet rifles mattered more than revolvers ever did. They hunted game, deterred predators, and decided conflicts long before anyone closed to handgun range. So cowboys adapted. They didn't hide rifles by making them disappear. They hid them by making them look ordinary. The first rule was this: a rifle that looked like work did not look like danger. When a man carried a long gun openly in a town, the difference between being ignored and being challenged often came down to posture and purpose. A rifle carried like a tool, angled down, wrapped, or bundled, blended into daily life. A rifle carried like a weapon did not. This is why many cowboys avoided carrying rifles on their backs in public. That position looked military, aggressive. It suggested readiness for violence. Instead, rifles were carried low, close to the body, or partially obscured, breaking up the outline so it didn't immediately register as a firearm. Cloth played a major role in this. A rifle wrapped in a blanket or oilcloth looked like cargo. Supplies, something boring. The human eye tends to ignore objects that don't announce themselves clearly. Cowboys exploited that instinct. A long bundle under one arm drew far less attention than a bare rifle held upright. This was not deception for deception's sake. It was risk management. In many towns, ordinances restricted firearms without explicitly mentioning rifles. Enforcement varied wildly depending on the sheriff, the mood of the town, and the individual carrying the gun. A wrapped rifle gave a man plausible deniability. It allowed him to pass without confrontation, questions, or delays. And delays were dangerous. Stopping a man in public to question him about a rifle put everyone on edge. Tempers flared, crowds gathered. The situation escalated. Cowboys preferred to avoid that entirely. On the trail, visibility created a different problem. A clearly visible rifle signaled value. Ammunition was expensive. Rifles were valuable. A man seen openly carrying a quality long gun might attract thieves or desperate men looking to upgrade their own equipment. By minimizing visibility, cowboys reduced the chance of becoming a target. This logic extended to how rifles were transported between locations. A rifle carried across the saddle in plain view made sense while riding. But once a man dismounted near others, that same rifle often moved into the hands or under an arm, wrapped or angled so it appeared less threatening. The goal was consistency. A cowboy who changed how he carried himself dramatically when armed drew attention. One who moved the same way, regardless of what he carried, blended in. Rifles were incorporated into that pattern rather than allowed to disrupt it. This is where public carry became an art. Cowboys paid attention to how people looked at them. They noticed when eyes lingered. They learned which towns were nervous and which were indifferent. They adjusted accordingly. A rifle carried openly on one street might be quietly wrapped on the next. None of this was written down. There were no manuals. These habits were passed through observation and experience. A man learned quickly what attracted trouble and what avoided it. And large rifles demanded that lesson faster than anything else, because rifles change the emotional temperature of a room. When a man entered a space with a visible long gun, conversations slowed, chairs scraped back, eyes tracked movement. Even if no one intended violence, the presence of the rifle made it feel possible. Cowboys who wanted to pass through without incident learned to soften that presence, not by surrendering the rifle, but by disguising its role. This is why so many historical photographs show rifles leaning against walls, resting in corners, or partially obscured by other objects. The rifle was there, always nearby, but it wasn't center stage. Public carry in the Old West was less about possession and more about presentation. The rifle you carried mattered less than how you made others perceive it. And that principle shaped every method cowboys used to move large rifles through public spaces without drawing the wrong kind of attention. Because in a world where everyone was armed and no one was fully safe, the most powerful advantage was not firepower. It was appearing unremarkable. From saddle to street, a rifle carried on horseback was one thing. A rifle carried on foot was something else entirely. This distinction mattered more than most people realize. On the open range, a long gun resting in a saddle scabbard or laid across the pommel was expected. It blended into the visual language of ranch work, hunting and travel. Horses, saddles, ropes, bedrolls, and rifles all belonged to the same category: tools of movement and labor. The moment a cowboy dismounted near other people, that context changed. A rifle that looked natural on horseback became conspicuous. The instant boots hit the ground. Now it was no longer part of the animal's equipment. It was part of the man, and that difference altered how others interpreted intent. Cowboys understood this instinctively. They did not think in abstract terms about optics or signaling, but they felt the consequences immediately. A man walking through town with a bare rifle in his hands invited attention whether he wanted it or not. Eyes followed him. Conversations paused. Lawmen noticed. Merchants became cautious. So cowboys developed a transition. The rifle rarely moved straight from saddle to shoulder. Instead, it passed through an intermediate state, one designed to soften its presence and disconnect it from aggression. Often, the first step was removal from the saddle in a way that looked routine. No sudden movements, no dramatic lifting. The rifle came free as part of unloading gear, the same way a bedroll or a blanket would. This mattered. People are less alarmed by actions that fit a recognizable pattern. Once free of the saddle, the rifle usually changed orientation. Rather than being carried upright, where the barrel announced itself immediately, it was angled downward or tucked under the arm. This broke the familiar silhouette. A long vertical line reads as a weapon. A diagonal bundle reads as cargo. Some cowboys rested the rifle across the forearm, muzzle forward and low, stock near the hip. From a distance, it resembled a fence rail or a length of lumber. Others held it close to the body, partially obscured by coat or blanket. This was not accidental. Human attention is drawn to contrast and clarity. A clearly defined object stands out. A partially obscured one fades into the background. Cowboys learned to reduce clarity. The saddle itself also played a role in this transition. Many riders kept an extra blanket, slicker, or a piece of canvas tied behind the cantle. When dismounting, this material often came off with a rifle already inside it. The bundle that resulted did not immediately read as a firearm. In towns where rifles were restricted or frowned upon, this made all the difference. A man walking with a bare Winchester was likely to be stopped. A man carrying a rolled blanket under his arm was not. This did not mean rifles were always hidden completely. That would have been impractical. Instead, they were visually reclassified. The goal was not invisibility, but ambiguity. Ambiguity buys time. It delays judgment. It prevents immediate categorization. And in a frontier environment, those seconds mattered. Cowboys also adjusted how long they carried rifles on foot. In many cases, the rifle's journey through public space was kept as short as possible. From stable to room, from a wagon to storefront, from hitching post to boarding house. Efficiency reduced exposure. This is why many establishments near town centers offered storage. Stables, hotels, and general stores sometimes kept rifles behind counters or in back rooms for customers. This arrangement benefited both sides. The business avoided visible weapons. The cowboy avoided hassle. But not every situation allowed for storage. When a rifle had to stay with the man, posture became critical. Cowboys avoided gripping the rifle tightly in public. A firm, two-handed hold suggested readiness. A relaxed carry suggested necessity. Even small changes mattered. A rifle held loosely by the balance point looked passive. One held near the trigger did not. Cowboys trained themselves out of habits that looked aggressive, not because they feared confrontation, but because they wanted to avoid it. This restraint contradicts the popular image of the West as reckless and confrontational. In reality, most men preferred predictability. Trouble cost time, money, and sometimes lives. Avoiding it was a skill. The rifle itself influenced these choices. Heavier rifles encouraged different handling than lighter carbines. A long, weighty barrel naturally rested low. A short, quick rifle tempted shoulder carry. Cowboys learned which behaviors drew attention and adjusted accordingly. Over time, these habits became automatic. A man did not consciously decide to angle his rifle or wrap it differently each time. His body did it for him. The frontier rewarded those who learned quickly and punished those who did not. This transition from saddle to street was one of the most important moments in public rifle carry. It was where most mistakes were made, and it was where experienced cowboys distinguished themselves from amateurs. The amateur showed the rifle. The professional managed it. And in a world where everyone was armed, that management often mattered more than the weapon itself. Wraps, bundles, and misdirection. The most effective way cowboys carried large rifles in public was not by hiding the weapon itself, but by hiding its meaning. This is the distinction that Hollywood never understood. A rifle did not need to disappear to become invisible. It only needed to stop looking like a rifle. On the frontier, nearly every object had a double life. Blankets were bedding at night and shelter during storms. Oilcloth kept rain off supplies and dust off tools. Canvas wraps protected meat, feed, or spare tack. Cowboys lived in a world of bundles, rolls, and improvised containers, and that environment made disguise easy. A long rifle wrapped in cloth immediately lost its identity. The straight lines broke apart. The metallic glint vanished. What remained was a shape so common that no one paid attention to it. A bundle under the arm could be bedding, tools, food, or nothing important at all. This was deliberate. Cowboys learned early that people ignore what they see every day. A man carrying a naked rifle drew the eye. A man carrying a blanket did not. And so rifles became blankets. The method mattered. The wrap was never tight like a sheath. That would have preserved the outline too clearly. Instead, it was loose, uneven, and imperfect. Corners sagged. Cloth overlapped irregularly. The goal was to make the shape feel accidental. Oilcloth was especially useful. It dulled sound, resisted moisture, and looked utilitarian. A rifle wrapped in oilcloth suggested cargo, not conflict. If asked, a cowboy could truthfully say it was supplies. Few people pushed further. Blankets served a similar purpose. Every cowboy carried one, sometimes two. Seeing a man with a blanket was expected. Seeing a man without one was suspicious. When a rifle disappeared inside that blanket, it simply became part of the background noise of frontier life. This practice extended into towns. In places where rifles were discouraged or questioned, a bundled rifle passed unnoticed through streets, stables, and even businesses. Lawmen were trained to look for threats, not bedding. A wrapped rifle did not match their mental checklist. Importantly, these bundles were still functional. A cowboy could unwrap a rifle quickly if needed. There were no buckles, straps, or rigid closures. A single motion could free the weapon. This balance between concealment and access was essential. Too much disguise made the rifle useless. Too little made it obvious. Experienced men practiced this without thinking. They wrapped rifles the same way every time. Muscle memory took over. In moments of stress, they did not fumble. Bundles also allowed rifles to be carried closer to the body. A bare rifle held at arm's length looks confrontational. A wrapped rifle tucked under the arm looks like personal property. The difference is subtle, but powerful. This technique also exploited social assumptions. People hesitate to interfere with someone carrying something awkward. A man balancing a bundle looks busy, preoccupied. Approaching him feels intrusive. Cowboys used that hesitation. Even thieves were less interested. A visible rifle promised immediate value. A bundle required investigation. Investigation created risk. Most opportunists chose easier targets. Wrapped rifles also moved easily between environments. A cowboy could carry the same bundle from the trail into town, from street to stable, from stable to room, without changing his posture. Consistency reduced scrutiny. There was also a psychological benefit. By hiding the rifle's identity, a cowboy reduced his own stress. He did not feel watched. He did not feel challenged. That calm mattered. Calm men make better decisions. Some cowboys went further. They added extra items to the bundle: rope, clothing, tools, anything that made the package bulkier and less defined. The rifle became just one component among many. This tactic was especially common when traveling through unfamiliar towns, in places where a man did not know the temperament of the sheriff or the mood of the locals. Ambiguity was safety. Notably, this method required no special equipment, no custom scabbards, no purpose-built concealment. It relied entirely on ordinary objects and ordinary behavior. That ordinariness was the point. The frontier rewarded men who blended in. Wrapped rifles allowed cowboys to remain unremarkable, even while armed with the most powerful tool they owned. This is why written records rarely mention the practice. It left no mark. No regulation addressed it. No incident called it out. It simply worked. Over time, this approach became instinctive. Cowboys did not think of it as concealment. They thought of it as carrying. The rifle was present, always close, but it did not announce itself. And in a world where announcing yourself often meant inviting trouble, that quiet mattered. This was not cowardice. It was discipline. Town laws, enforcement loopholes, and quiet compliance. When large rifles met town limits, the frontier stopped being informal and started becoming political. This was the moment where personal survival collided with public order. Contrary to popular belief, most frontier towns did not welcome visible firearms. By the 1870s and 1880s, places like Dodge City, Abilene, Tombstone, Wichita, and Deadwood had all experimented with weapon restrictions. These ordinances were not born from pacifism. They were born from economics. Merchants wanted customers, hotel owners wanted guests, town councils wanted rail money, and nothing scared investment away faster than gunfire in the street. Rifles posed a special problem. Unlike pistols, they could not be easily surrendered, checked discreetly, or ignored. A long gun carried openly was impossible to overlook. It announced potential violence, even if none was intended. For lawmen trying to project authority, that visibility undermined control. So towns created rules that were intentionally vague. Most ordinances focused on deadly weapons without defining every category. Enforcement was left to sheriffs and marshals, who interpreted the law based on circumstance, reputation, and mood. This flexibility was intentional. It allowed towns to appear orderly without provoking constant confrontation. Cowboys quickly learned how this system actually worked. Compliance was performative. A man who cooperated publicly, who appeared respectful and non-threatening, was rarely pressed hard. A man who challenged authority or displayed his rifle openly invited scrutiny. The law was not applied evenly. It was applied situationally. This is where quiet compliance emerged as the dominant strategy. Rather than argue, cowboys adapted their behavior to fit within the appearance of the law. They avoided overt defiance while maintaining practical readiness. A wrapped rifle, a bundled long gun, or a rifle left just out of sight satisfied both sides. Lawmen understood what was happening. Most had been cowboys themselves. They knew the difference between a man passing through and a man looking for trouble. They also knew that pushing too hard created enemies they could not afford. As long as order was maintained on the surface, deeper inspection was rare. This created enforcement loopholes. A rifle wrapped in canvas was technically still present, but not visibly carried as a weapon. A rifle stored temporarily at a stable or boarding house was accessible without being displayed. A rifle leaning just inside a doorway was not on the street. None of these practices violated the spirit of the law as towns understood it. The goal was not disarmament. The goal was predictability. Cowboys who grasped this distinction moved freely. Those who didn't learned quickly. There are scattered accounts of rifles being confiscated or men being fined, but these incidents were usually tied to attitude rather than equipment. A cooperative man might be warned. A defiant one might be punished. This reinforced a cultural lesson. Blending in mattered more than being right. Cowboys adjusted how they entered town. They slowed down. They dismounted earlier. They wrapped rifles before they reached the first building. They watched how others behaved and mirrored it. This behavior was not cowardice. It was intelligence. Open confrontation with town authority benefited no one. Cowboys needed supplies, rest, and information. Towns needed money and labor. Quiet compromise served both. The result was a strange equilibrium. Rifles were everywhere, but rarely obvious. Men were armed, but not threatening. The law existed, but flexed. This balance allowed frontier towns to function without stripping travelers of their means of protection. Importantly, this system depended on mutual understanding. When outsiders arrived, soldiers unfamiliar with local norms, Eastern visitors expecting strict enforcement, or criminals looking to exploit loopholes, friction increased. These were the moments when towns cracked down temporarily, searches became more aggressive, and tolerance narrowed. Cowboys noticed these shifts immediately. They paid attention to patrol patterns, posted notices, and gossip. Information traveled fast. A town that was strict one week might be relaxed the next. Adaptation was constant. This environment rewarded subtlety. A man who understood how to comply without surrendering control could operate almost anywhere. A man who insisted on overt rights quickly found himself isolated. Large rifles, therefore, became tools not just of survival, but of negotiation. How you carried them signaled whether you understood the unwritten rules. Wrapped rifles, discreet transfers, and indirect storage were not just tactics. They were social skills, and like all social skills, they separated those who thrived from those who struggled. As towns modernized, these gray areas shrank. Enforcement became standardized. Paperwork replaced discretion. The frontier moved on. But for a critical period, quiet compliance allowed cowboys to carry the most powerful weapons of their world through public spaces without ever announcing them. And that silence was the real secret. Normalized secrecy and the disappearing practice. By the late frontier years, these methods no longer felt clever. They felt normal. That's the part that matters most. What began as conscious adaptation slowly turned into habit. Cowboys stopped thinking about why they wrapped rifles a certain way or angled them low when walking into town. They simply did it. The body learned the rules before the mind ever articulated them. A man didn't wake up and decide to disguise his rifle. He woke up and carried it the way he always had. And that is how practices disappear without ever being erased. Once something becomes routine, it stops being explained. No one writes manuals for habits that feel obvious. No one records behaviors that don't stand out. A wrapped rifle didn't feel like a tactic. It felt like manners. That subtle shift is what ultimately removed these practices from history. Because historians tend to record what is argued about, outlawed, or celebrated. They record laws, conflicts, and spectacles. They rarely record what everyone quietly agrees on. By the time towns became more stable, the question of how to carry a rifle in public had already been solved socially. Not by legislation alone, but by shared expectation. You didn't carry a rifle openly because it caused problems. You wrapped it because it didn't. No one needed to say more than that. This unspoken agreement allowed towns and travelers to coexist during a volatile period without constant friction. Cowboys got what they needed. Towns maintained the appearance of order. Lawmen preserved authority without escalating every interaction. But it also meant that no single group ever claimed ownership of the practice. It wasn't a lawman's technique. It wasn't a criminal's trick. It wasn't even uniquely a cowboy's habit. It belonged to the environment. And when the environment changed, the habit lost its anchor. As railroads shortened distances and permanent settlements replaced transient camps, the pressure that made subtle rifle carry necessary eased. Men no longer spent days moving between lawless stretches and regulated towns. The frontier stopped oscillating between chaos and control. That oscillation was what had made discretion essential. Without it, overt carry became easier to tolerate. Storage options increased. Rules became clearer. The gray zones that once required constant negotiation narrowed. And with that narrowing came simplification. Rifles were either allowed or not, carried or stored, legal or illegal. The nuanced middle ground, where rifles were present but visually muted, faded first. Not because it failed, but because it was no longer needed. And once it was no longer needed, it stopped being taught. Young men entering frontier work late in the era learned simplified rules. They learned what was permitted, not how to navigate perception. They learned regulations, not instincts. This generational shift mattered. The men who had lived through the most dangerous years carried knowledge that never fully transferred. Their habits remained, but their explanations vanished. To outsiders, their behavior looked like preference, not strategy. And preference doesn't get written down. As the West transitioned into history, writers, photographers, and filmmakers arrived too late to see the system in motion. They observed fragments without context, a rifle carried openly here, a wrapped bundle there. No consistent explanation tying them together, so they filled in the gaps with what made sense to them. They assumed visibility equaled confidence. They assumed concealment equaled fear. They assumed weapons were meant to be seen. Those assumptions felt intuitive, and they were wrong. But once they took hold, they became difficult to undo. The real practices were too quiet to compete with louder stories. A wrapped rifle doesn't photograph well. A bundled long gun doesn't read clearly on screen. An unremarkable man moving without incident doesn't make a compelling scene. So the image shifted. The rifle became a symbol instead of a tool. Carriage became posture instead of strategy. And the logic that once governed public behavior dissolved into aesthetic. By the time Hollywood cemented its version of the West, the practical knowledge was already gone. There were no surviving voices insisting that things had worked differently. No records explaining the why behind the how. All that remained were artifacts without instructions, boots without context, hats without meaning, rifles without the habits that once shaped their use. And that is how the most effective practices disappear. Not through force, but through silence. Which is why understanding how cowboys carried large rifles in public isn't just about weapons. It's about how humans adapt to danger quietly, and how those adaptations vanish once the danger is no longer obvious. That understanding sets the stage for what came next, because once the practice was forgotten, something else rushed in to replace it. A story. A cleaner, louder, more dramatic version of the past. One that made sense to people who never had to live it. The myth, the legacy, and what was really going on. By the time the frontier began to fade, the way cowboys carried rifles in public had already been rewritten in people's memories. Not because it changed overnight, but because the people who understood it stopped explaining it. As railroads spread, towns stabilized, and law enforcement became more formalized, the quiet systems cowboys relied on lost their necessity. Public carry no longer required the same constant negotiation. Violence became less personal, less immediate, and more regulated. The environment that rewarded subtlety began to disappear. What remained was a story. And stories don't preserve nuance. They simplify. They exaggerate. They turn survival habits into symbols. The rifle, once a practical tool managed carefully in public, became an icon. It was lifted out of its real context and placed into myth. Instead of being something a man carefully disguised, angled, wrapped, or downplayed, it became something he proudly displayed. This shift didn't happen because cowboys suddenly changed their behavior. It happened because the people telling the stories were no longer living the reality. Dime novels needed drama. Early photography needed clarity. Later films needed silhouettes that read instantly on screen. A rifle wrapped in a blanket looks like nothing on camera. A rifle slung across the back looks powerful. So that's the version that survived. But that version is backwards. In the real West, the man openly displaying a rifle in public wasn't confident. He was reckless. He was either inexperienced, spoiling for trouble, or unaware of the social rules that actually governed frontier life. The experienced cowboy did the opposite. He controlled how others perceived him. He understood that power announced itself only when it had to. Until then, it stayed quiet. This is the part modern audiences struggle with because we're used to thinking of visibility as strength. In the frontier, visibility was vulnerability. A visible rifle invited questions. Questions invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited conflict. So rifles were carried in ways that blurred those steps, wrapped, angled, bundled, stored just out of sight, moved quickly through public spaces and kept close but unremarkable. This wasn't fear. It was efficiency. Cowboys didn't think in terms of rights or symbolism. They thought in terms of outcomes. Would this action slow me down? Would it attract attention? Would it create a problem I don't need? If the answer was yes, they adapted. That mindset is what disappeared when the West became a legend. Once rifles were no longer daily necessities for survival, they became props. Once danger was abstracted into stories, the subtle behaviors that minimized it were forgotten. What we're left with today is an image of the cowboy as loud, confrontational, and permanently armed in the open. The truth is quieter. The real cowboy spent more energy managing perception than displaying power. He knew that being armed wasn't enough. You had to be armed without becoming interesting. That principle didn't die with the frontier. It simply moved into other spaces. You can see echoes of it in modern military doctrine, in security work, in survival training, and even in urban life. The idea that preparedness should not advertise itself is as old as danger itself. The Old West just refined it under extreme conditions. So when you picture a cowboy carrying a large rifle through a town, don't imagine him striding down the street with it slung proudly across his back. Imagine him moving deliberately, wrapped bundle under one arm, rifle angled low, posture relaxed, eyes up, attention outward. Nothing about him looks threatening, and that's exactly why he makes it through without trouble. That's the reality Hollywood never shows you. Not because it isn't interesting, but because it doesn't look dramatic unless you understand what you're seeing. The real drama wasn't in the weapon. It was in the restraint. It was in knowing when not to show what you had. And once you understand that, the Old West stops looking like a place ruled by guns and starts looking like a place ruled by judgment. Judgment about when to act. Judgment about when to blend in. Judgment about how much of yourself to reveal. That's what separated the men who survived from the men who became stories. If you've watched this far, you now know something most people never learn. Not because it's hidden, but because it was never loud enough to be remembered. If you want more real frontier history like this, the kind that strips away the myth and explains how people actually lived, moved, and survived, make sure to like the video and subscribe. There are more truths buried under the legend, and we're not done uncovering them.